Good morning, everybody. Norela Constantinescu speaking. I am a research, development, and innovation manager in ENTSO-E. We are pleased to have you here for this flexibility framework and mapping webinar, where we will have as guests and speakers Mr. Laurent Schmidt, the Secretary General of ENTSO-E, who is going to do the introduction, will be followed by the Chair of Research Development and Innovation Committee of ENTSO-E, Mr. Hakon Bergen from Statnet. Then one of our experts in ENTSO-E who worked very hard for about half a year to develop this flexibility framework where we gathered different projects around the subject and we were able to drive some conclusions. And afterwards, we will have Helena Gerard, senior researcher at Energy Ville, who is also very much involved in Bridge initiative, where actually the Horizon 2020 projects, they gather and they develop together common recommendations regarding flexibility, platforms, TSO, DSO cooperation. You will be able to ask questions during the webinar. This has to be written and we will try to answer those questions. We will have at the end of the webinar a session of questions and answers. And I will maybe use the opportunity to also make myself your voice and also drive a little bit these questions towards some concrete answers where we have to go ahead with our projects and with our developments, and we should identify maybe research needs if necessary. So I would like to welcome first Laurent Schmidt. In this framework, which became actually the tool for our research and innovation. So the BNI, where we have put the platform together with the startups, with the industries, with the TSOs, with the institutes of research. We have more than 200 members. And this is a webinar in a series we have done until now. And we are looking forward, of course, for the future ones. So Laurent, now the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Norella. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm going to very briefly introduce why is flexibility so important in the current context of the transformation of the energy system. I would like to apologize, there is a bit of noise around me, so I hope it's not going to disturb too much the next few minutes. So if you go to the next slide, we all know that we are in a very ambitious framework when it comes to transforming our systems. The Clean Energy Package is setting up a new objective for 2030, over 32% target of renewable energy, not electricity, but really energy, so a much higher targets on electricity, obviously. So this is equal to around 43% on electricity, further interconnection targets, as well as very ambitious targets on energy efficiency. So really, we worked out on the last 3 months in ENTSO-E at analyzing what are the possible development scenario of the European power system to achieve these new ambitions. And we know that the new commission, which was just started a few days ago, is currently also investigating potentially going further to these targets as part of their new EU Green Deal objectives. If we go to the following slides, so what do we see as key input to develop our scenarios is an absolute evidence that there will be some acceleration in the coal phase out across Europe between now and 2030. So basically, That will mean some change in the amount of rotating machines, rotating mass in the power system. We see that the objective is going to will require to reach almost full carbon neutrality in the power sector around 2040. So that graph is actually taking out of analysis which was produced in last November by the Commission. And then we really see as well that basically starting in 2040, when the system will have completely decarbonized on the power system, we will need to introduce new ways of supporting other sectors which cannot be easily electrified to decarbonize, introducing power fuels, sector coupling, power to X, and which is expanding further the transformation of our system. If we go to the following slide, we have analyzed this and we have just now published our new development trajectory scenarios very recently, and looking at basically a baseline story, a base storyline scenario, which is analyzing what is currently into the objective of each country, bottom-up national energy and climate plans, and then deriving from there two other more top-down trajectory, one around which we qualify as global ambition, which stick as close as possible to the COP21 targets, and which is looking at decarbonizing, I would say, the system more through centralized resources, and another one which is more on distributed energy, which is more a decarbonization path through distributed resources. And now we are compiling all these data to be able to project various scenarios of development for our power system at the pan-European level. If we go to the following slides, we see the significant impact, and these are the first projection just produced. It has on the energy mix. So this is really a mix on the primary energy. So this analysis is produced jointly between ENTSO-E and ENTSO-G. And you clearly see that the full phase out of coal, you clearly see that in 2050, the system will only rely, I would say, on carbon neutral fuel with a very significant share of wind, of solar PV, and as well as introduction of course, hydro pump storage, some amount of nuclear. But what is really impressive into this scenario of climate neutrality is the amount of renewable energy share in the primary mix, which, depending on the scenario, reach between 64 and 80%, which is an absolute significant transformation of the system as a whole. If we go to the following slide, the analysis is also looking at the trajectory of how much can we reasonably project in terms of electrification rates. A key question, of course, electricity is a very obvious way of basically bringing carbon efficiency into other sectors, but we also see some limitation how far we can go. So we start today from 20%, and we see basically in our scenarios targets between 40 and 50% on the electrification rate, hence, or maybe, and we compare this with the existing scenarios in place, and basically the power fuels, as what we call, or the sector coupling, comes as an extra layer to enable to decarbonize other sector which cannot be easily electrified. So, but it's a significant step for the electrical sector, and we talk about more than doubling the amount of electrification. So a significant reinforcement and change in the same time of this power system. If we go to the next slide, we are also very carefully looking at what does that mean in terms of adequacy and flexibility. And we definitely see a significant jump into 2040 on the required amount of battery storage. Basically, we refer as flexibility as battery here, with some amount, of course, of demand response, with various scenarios are analyzed between the distributed energy and global ambition. And we see the impact that it has also into the amount of hydrogen potentially production. It would imply to be able to match these difficulty of seasonal storage And in the introduction of that webinar, what is very important is to understand that flexibility has really various patterns. Some pattern is related really to the stability of the electrical grid system, but we should not forget also the need of basically managing few days without renewable into the system. So hence a lot of question around basically seasonal or several days ahead storage. So we now start having solid figures on that. If we go to the next slides, in the same time, we do see, so that's coming from the broad figure, the broad perspective of how the system transforming. We are also analyzing in parallel a lot what's happening in terms of a pilot, in terms of enabling new flexibilities, particularly into the context of the TSO, DSO activities which we have, and the very close partnership which happens between ENTSO-E and the other DSO association. And we have started to map and build up a catalog of best practices of various TSO, DSO cooperation. We do contribute into a various Horizon 2020 project, and that serves also as an input into analyzing how these new flexibility needs are evolving. If you go to the following slide, so that drills down a bit on analyzing what kind of marketplace for flexibility is getting established. I'm not going to go into this detail. I think the next part of the presentation is going to really cover that, but we really see a set of very interesting best practices being deployed in various European countries. Europe is not the same everywhere. We refer it as a system of systems, one system of systems, and with some specificities in terms of framework, in terms of role, size of DSOs, which needs to be taken care of in the development of this future flexibility framework. If we go to the following slide, what is very important for us is also to think at all these deployments and these systems of systems deployment into a broad concept of interoperability, particularly in terms of product flexibility, products being exchanged. So we do have a lot of ongoing activities around our new balancing platform, but also in terms of underlying ICT, IT, and digital infrastructure, and making sure we get, I would say, a system of systems as interconnectable as possible. And we also do work a lot right now in ENTSO-E, in the TSO community, on reusing IEC standards and developing the common grid model as the strong underlying base for facilitating interoperability across systems, particularly when it's related to grid data and all what goes with the associated operational technologies. If we go to the following slide, I would just like to conclude that this introduction is really a joint teamwork of our entire association. So basically, the best expert of the entire 42 TSO of Europe. And we are confident that it's going to be a very interesting base to guide the development of this future system. We are right now in consultation around our scenario. So if you want more detail, please look at the detail of these scenarios. Do interact with us. Very interested to, at that stage, to be challenged in terms of assumptions, visions, and so on. Our objective is to be able to finalize and these three trajectories within end of January, so that we can use it very transversely and widely in our TSOs to basically produce our next innovation and other roadmaps required to transform this system. Thanks you very much, and I give the floor to Akon now, I think.
Thank you very much, Laurent. Now we can go to
Okay, can you hear me, everybody? Håkon Borgen here. I'm chairing RDIC, Research and Development and Innovation Committee. I started 1st of July. First, I would like to introduce my speech by one picture. So if you can please give the first slide. Second, this one. Just to understand the need for innovation, I think this slide is pretty good to understand the scale of actually what we are about to do and what we are just seeing now as a need for transformation. This slide shows the emissions in 1990 and compared to the goals in 2050. It's pretty evident that we need to do a lot, and we need to understand the challenge. And if you take Green Deal on board, as you mentioned, Laurent, this small cloud will even disappear. So I think we need to cooperate. We need to exchange knowledge. We need to prioritize what we actually have to do, and we have to accelerate the innovation. And innovation is as important as it can be. So we have to lift up that dimension in between the players, within the TSOs, within the DSOs, within all companies around, and then we have to share knowledge and have to try to align the focus as much as we can. Next slide. Just to make an example of what will face us in, let's say, 20 years, the change will actually be that we will have a system which will generate power by renewables, where we have, let's say, can you mute? Thank you. We will have about 500 gigawatt in 1 hour, consisting of offshore, onshore wind and solar. And within a few hours, it can be only 10 gigawatt. So going from 500 gigawatt down to 10 gigawatt within hours. That will be the case in 2040.
I go on
and
because I cannot.
Looking at the market we have today, we then realize that
It was better
with all this wind and all this renewable, the price in a way will collapse for many hours. You might say 20% of the time where the price in itself will be extremely low or even negative, unless we innovate, come up with new solutions, new flexibility products, introduce new markets, which can lift this to a higher price, where you have a sound business case for investing new technologies and innovate in new solutions. And that again should be brought back to those hours where the adequacy problem is as high as it can be. And in this black curve, you see what will happen without extra flexibility, and that will for sure not be accepted by the society and by the politicians and by the customers. So it's an inherent need to come up with new technical solutions, but also market solutions, and it's a wide range of changes which has to be done, and time is limited, and that's why we have to act together. Next, please. Well, TSOs, of course, would like to cooperate on this and would like to work together. And we have already for many years focused on pan-European large-scale initiatives, where this interface and coordinate projects are examples of flex initiatives between us. And in the future, we will do this even more. And we will update, as you said, Laurent, the new RDIC plan to focus on this. And we would like to take on board the challenges we see on the flex even more in the future. Next, please. And we also see that it's evolving TSO-DSO's cooperation framework every day, and there are key areas of common interest we have to work together on between the roles and responsibilities between the TSOs and DSOs, the interfaces between the DSOs and TSOs, the active and reactive power management, the digitalization in itself, including the data management, coordination of planning of network, and network codes, guidelines, and of course R&D schemes. And also in 2019, a new report on active system management was launched. And I was also in Helsinki to present the work we did in this 10 years anniversary celebration. And then I also presented the, next slide please, the new report, which was delivered by ENTSO-E, which is a scan of more than approximately 100 projects which deals with digitalization within the TSOs. And it's really a survey what is really going on, and it's a lot going on in the digitalization. And we see that we are facing a cyber physical grid. It's not only physical, it's a digital grid on top of it, which will consist of layers, and that is going on now. We have the physical grid, we have the data layer, we have the system operation layer, we have the market layer, and we have the sector coupling layer. And then, as Laurent talked about, the interoperability, how that is done, is a key issue in the years to come, because this should actually be robust and resilient in the future. And then we need new ways of doing that, and we will focus on the interoperability quite a lot in the coming years, and we have to do that together. And also the cyber security is a key issue here, and that also calls for a lot of new innovation. And then last, I would like to say that it's actually not about technology. It's actually more about the mindset, how we're actually going to solve this. Thank you.
Thank you, Håkon, to take us through this short introduction to what we have done actually in ENTSO-E regarding the flexibility survey, but also the digital inputs. I would like now to pass to Matthias, which is also coming from Statnet, but which was working very hard actually for getting this overview through a multitude of projects you have seen presented by Laurent and by Håkon. Matthias, floor is yours.
Thank you, Norella. Good morning. I will present the work we have done in the working group 3 on flexibility and markets, where we did a mapping of research projects and where we actually are. And on next slide, and the next again and again, you can see the motivation and what kind of methodology we used. The main goal of this work is to lay a basis to can identify where are the research gaps. So this work was really focused on research and development projects. And yes, we selected and summarized ongoing and recent research projects on flexibility in Europe, and clustered the different flexibility solutions they looked on, and tried to make some common conclusions on how far have we come for different flexibility solutions. And today the next step will actually be to find the research gaps, but today I only will present what we have found in this mapping. And in this mapping, if you go to the next slide, we used, as we call it, a general framework for power system flexibility, because there was a need to really could cluster different solutions to compare it, but also to be quite specific on what we mean with one flexibility solution. So if you see here, we have the flexibility sources, the power system needs, and the flexibility instruments. And of course, flexibility sources that are all kinds of sources that can actually deliver flexibility. But that's not enough. They also have to deliver it to really help the power system. So also this framework is from the power system perspective. And there are different needs for flexibility in the power system. But then also the question, how do we get this flexibility? Is it markets or other instruments? So there can be difference on the flexibility instruments to use actually the sources. And then of the source deliver kind of services to solve needs in the power system. And the flexibility solution here is then a combination of different sources or one source that can deliver flexibility and that helps to solve one or several power system needs. We are, for example, a market. And on the next slide, I can explain more about the flexibility sources we have looked into or how we have structured the picture. We used a quite obvious approach. So we have structured into generation, demand, and storage. And then we have some subgroups below. And one important point here is we have structured electric vehicles into demand. Since the main purpose of a vehicle is not to store electricity. The main purpose is actually people want to drive from A to B. And that's why we have put it in the demand category. And then in storage, we have structured based on technology. What kind of different storage is available? Everything from batteries to supercapacitors, some kind of mechanical storage like flywheels, compressed air storage, but also the chemical storage, hydrogen, and thermal storage. And on the next slide, you see how we have structured or how we distinguish different instruments. There are 5 different instruments we have distinguished into, but the main important are the first 2 one. It's how we call it explicit flexibility or market incentive-based instruments. It means that flexibility is dispatched by market-based activation. So you have to trade actually on a market. It's not important which market, but you have to trade on it, and there has to be some product specifications for the service you have to deliver. And then this is then the explicit flexibility. And then we have price-based instruments where customers more in a passive way, so to say, react to price signals without participating actively in markets. And such kind of price signals, they can arise from variable power prices or also variable grid tariffs that for example, make a difference between peak hours and non-peak hours. On the next slide, there we have the power system needs. So why actually do we need flexibility, or what should flexibility used for? And here we try to structure it into these 2 perspectives. The system perspective is really on, we have to balance demand and production on all time horizons. And it's everything from adequacy, which is more long-term horizon, to a more short-term horizon, like to have a stable frequency, even if something's happening in the grid. And until if really something is happening and we have an outage, then the frequency still could need to lower the consequences of that outage. Let's say that fewer consumers are affected, for example. And also flexibility could be used for that kind of that kind. And then we have the grid perspective, and there it's mainly on, we have a need for transfer capacities and also to do congestion management if there are some bottlenecks. And of course, flexibility can be used to do congestion management. And of course, we also have to keep the voltage stable and have good power quality. And also for this also a use case for flexibility and the need the power system has. And all this categories and structures I've shown now. That's somehow is like a huge matrix, or that we can put the flexibility solutions directly in and say, okay, now we're looking on a flexibility solution that looks on batteries, and these batteries should be used for keep this frequency stable, and via a flexibility market. And then we have defined a flexibility solution in a good way, and we can look more into where we are today. So if we go on now to the next slide, and then when we have defined these flexibility solutions and mapped, then we use the technology readiness level scale to say how far we have come. How far is the research or development? Is it already maybe demonstrated, or is it really in the early stages and they're still only building competence on it? Yes, and on the next slide, I want to show, and the slide after it, what we actually have mapped, what are the data sources. We looked into 66 research projects, but in each research project is not only one demonstration or use case, they consisted of 105 of these cases. And then I say we mapped it in this flexibility framework and clustered them into flexibility solutions. And information sources we used were reports and project lists from ENTSO-E and DNVGL, ATIP-SNet, and Horizon 2020. And we also cooperated with the TSO group in ENTSO-E, and they already had done a mapping on specific TSO-DSO projects, and many of them are also focusing on flexibility. And then we collected data and information from all available sources like websites, deliverables, reports, and also had direct meetings and communication with the project experts and organizers. Yes, on the next slide, we see what the scope is. We focused on Europe since we are ENTSO-E. And we only included projects that are either ongoing or that are completed after 2015. Yes. And you see that we, in the end, mapped 21 flexibility solutions. So we structured these use cases or the different projects into 21 flexibility solutions. Yes, on the next slide, we want to provide some statistics that we have more feeling on what we have looked at on, and you can see that maybe was many ongoing projects we looked into, and also almost the same amount of completed. And if you see who is involved in this project, it only was TSO. There were maybe 25 to 30% TSOs only were involved in the project. Then there were the same amount of projects with DSOs, and then of course also some with TSO-DSO. And you also have some where none of us has participated. And there's more statistics on the next slide to show you how the distribution is on the different categories, which I have presented before. And the main message here is that if you look on the flexibility source, a lot of research is ongoing on storage. It's all the purple part. And on instruments, you also can see a lot of research is ongoing on market-based instruments. And on the needs, it looks like most of the concerns are on adequacy. At least most of the research is ongoing or completed on this part, and congestion management and frequency balancing. But voltage stability and reliability of supply, that's not so many projects we have found. Yes, and if you go on the next slide. Now we have mapped these solutions into 3 different matrices, which I will introduce when we look on them. So if you go on the next slide, that's the first matrix that we call the technical matrix, because there were a lot of projects really looking on how to improve flexibility from different sources of flexibility. So let's say develop better batteries, or how to make more efficient hydrogen production from electricity, etc. We mapped a lot of this kind of projects, and this matrix now shows on what they focused, on what kind of sources, and on what kind of needs these flexibility solutions should cover. And again, we have not enough time to go in deep here, but you see battery technology. On the right side, you see how many demonstrations we have counted, and battery is in lead, so to say. But also there's a lot of going on flywheel and different compressed air storage solutions. And all the white spots, there we have not found projects, or at least what not part of the scope. And if you go to the next slide, please. Then, and one challenge was we could not map all the solutions in one matrix because it was really messy. So now we have one matrix that focus really only on flexibility solutions that look on market-based instruments. And as you see, there's a lot of research ongoing or completed on different kind of market platforms and how they should be designed and how they could work. But also a lot of research is ongoing on the aggregation, how to aggregate small scale demand. Yes, and as you see, for example, reliability of supply. As I said before, flexibility also could be used for reducing the consequences of outages. And there we found not so much. There only was one project that looked into microgrids, and only one task in this project looked into how microgrid could help to reduce consequences in an outage situation. And that's why you see there's different boxes on both local energy trading and virtual power plants, but also on aggregation of actually industrial demand. So a lot is going on. If you go to the next slide, this slide summarizes all other instruments which are not market-based. So as I showed you before, this price-based instruments, information-based, dual-based, agreement-based, as we call them. And as you see, it's a lot of white spots here. There's a lot ongoing on demand response and how demand response react if you give them information. And it can be on power prices, or it can only be information on how the network or the grid is utilized, and that it would be nice if you would now move your demand to another point. So that's the only research we have found, which was not market-based. And also, as you can see, then a lot of research, it's only on demand side, but not so much on storage or generation. Yes, and if you go on the next slide. And for each of these boxes, it's one clustered flexibility solution. And for each of the boxes, we have created such a fact sheet where we again describe what we mean with battery technology, for example, in this example, or we've had microgrid before, what we mean with microgrid. And we also gave some more reasoning why we have chosen the technology readiness level we have chosen. Here it was at 8, and also we had some more summary of which kind of projects we have found and what is all this conclusions based on, which countries are involved in this project, etc. And I think we all will publish these fact sheets, but they still have to go through a quality check. Yes, if you go to the next slide, please. So I really want to summarize and conclude a little bit. Again, most of the research we mapped addressed either technical solutions, and there especially battery storage. So really research on technical things. And the other more opposite side is on how to use markets. Do we need new kind of markets that can help to get the flexibility for our needs? And how could you design these markets, and how should the products be, and how should communication be, etc., and how should the roles be? A lot of research is also on this part. And then, as I showed before, there's a little bit of research ongoing on how demand react on variable prices or on information they get. But we didn't find so much research on, as we call it, regulation or agreement-based instruments. And we had until now no discussion or made no conclusions on this. So it could be that's not a domain of R&D, or it's not perceived as so important to make actually research and development. I mean, a lot is ongoing, of course, with grid codes, etc., and that's not R&D, and we only have mapped R&D activities and not other activities. Another possible explanation could be also that we had to omit some projects in the mapping because we had to focus on what we seemed was most important flexibility projects, and it's possible that we then have excluded some of these projects. Or a possible conclusion could be actually there is a lack of research, but we have not concluded on this. And if you see on the next slide, we come back to that what we have found a lot of research on, and that is, as I said, technical solutions, and they mainly addressed the needs of frequency balancing, congestion management, or adequacy. And there particularly there's a lot of research how storage could deliver these services. On the market-based instruments, there was, as I said already, a lot of research ongoing on new or existing markets. There also for frequency balancing, congestion management, and or adequacy. And especially market platform, or really a research area, we found a lot of projects and activities. And there is some competition, so to say, because we saw a lot of overlap of the market platforms. Many try to solve the same problem, and they cover similar solutions. And in most of the gaps we actually found in the technical matrix can be explained due to low technical fit of the solutions, because not each flexibility source can deliver for each need based on the technical characteristics of, for example, a battery or a flywheel. Yes, and I think that concludes my presentation. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthias, for guiding us through quite comprehensive work done on these 66 projects related to flexibility, sources, platforms, and also other type of products, and by scanning through the different flexibility sources. I would like to remind the participants that they can ask questions in the right hand side of the screen, and we will be happy to answer. And I will ask actually the panelists to look into that and to try to answer those questions. So after seeing this flexibility mapping, which we have done in ENTSO-E for, of course, projects where TSOs are involved, we go now to Helena to see actually if we have more or less aligned messages following the bridge initiative, especially now in the TSO cooperation. And Helena, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Norella. So good morning, everybody. So in the next 20 minutes, I will give you a brief overview of a survey that we conducted within the scope of Bridge, focused on TSO-DSO cooperation. There are actually two sections in this survey. One was focusing more on regulation and markets. The other was focusing more on data. For the aspect on data, we will not present it today, but also the slides will be made available afterwards. So if you have specific questions related to the material collected on the data side, don't hesitate to send them afterwards to Norella. So next slide, please. So maybe just briefly, Bridge. Bridge is combining the different projects that are, let's say, funded under the Horizon 2020 framework. And there are basically 4 working groups. So the survey, as I mentioned, is a joint effort between the data management and the regulation working group. Next slide. Next, yeah. So there are many of the projects that were mentioned during previous presentation are also part of Bridge. And as you see that the projects that are currently working in Bridge are the projects that started in 2016, 17, 18, or 19. And you see this covers most or mainly the big demo calls. So you will see a little less emphasis on technology development like storage, which were more like the earlier projects that were also taken into account by the survey that Matthias did. We focus more on these large demo projects that focus more on indeed the interaction on data and markets. Next slide. So the report that I will present today, it's something, it's based on a study that started over summer, and the final report will be published by the end of December. And the idea of the report will be that this creates also new areas of research for upcoming calls. Next slide. Yeah, next. Okay, so maybe briefly, what were then the topics in this regulation survey? So first of all, we were looking at the different products and services that were developed and tested in these projects. Second, we wanted to see what is the impact on coordination between system operators and the related market design. Third, we did a zoom on the different roles of system operators and the role models used. And finally, we were looking at, okay, which of the topics are not yet addressed, but are very relevant for future research. Next slide. So this is just briefly an overview of the projects that participated to the survey. Next. So if we look at one of the key conclusions, so is it more services for TSOs or for DSOs? We see that there is a wide variety. There are projects dealing only with DSOs, some projects dealing with only with TSO services, and a lot of projects taking both services for TSOs and DSOs on board. And it also reflects in the different models for coordination, which are also or only focusing on inter-TSO coordination, sometimes only inter-DSO coordination, but a lot of projects cover multiple dimensions of coordination between system operators. Next slide. If we then zoom on the products and services that are developed, then we see that what is clear that for TSO and DSO, there is a huge focus on congestion management. That's clearly something which has not yet been addressed or is not fully clear yet today. If we then see for the TSO side, there is also a big emphasis on every type of service that can support frequency. For the DSO, it's clear that grid capacity management, and voltage control are important. Next slide. If we then continue a little bit, why are these services developed? Then I could say there is also not really a surprise. And the elements that are most mentioned are the reduction in curtailment, reduction in imbalance, reduction in CO2 emissions, avoiding a certain grid investments, and increase of the hosting capacity of RES. And if we then look at these services, who are the, let's say, the providers of these services, then it's clear that we mainly look at services that can be supplied by traditional suppliers, traditional aggregators, network operators, so the DSO providing services to the TSO. The element of consumers, it's a little less, and typically new concepts or business models like energy communities is something which is not yet tackled in the ongoing projects and will clearly be something that should be addressed in future projects. Next slide. If we then look at the main conclusions on coordination and market design, then we see that most of the projects tackle coordination in the operational planning or real-time scope. So there is less emphasis on network planning. Also, similar to previous presentation, we see that there is a big emphasis on the market-based flexibility mechanisms. However, also technical and rule-based mechanisms are investigated, or even connection agreements and tariff structures, but to a lesser extent. Also, if we look at the type of marketplace, there are indeed a lot of market platforms in these projects available. There is a huge emphasis on local and distributed market concepts and less on centralized concepts, which is indeed interesting as these are more disruptive concepts compared to what we have today. Next slide. If we then look at the roles and responsibilities, there is one element which is very different across projects, but also very debatable, is the role of the market operator. We see that almost all projects have somehow a marketplace that is operated by a market operator, but sometimes this market operator is a DSO, sometimes it's a TSO, sometimes it's a commercial entity or another regulated entity. So you see many different options. So it's still an open discussion also between projects under which condition we should have a market operator, which is a system operator, under which conditions should it be a regulated entity, but maybe not a system operator, or when should it be a market operator, which is left to the commercial domain. Next slide. If we then look at the way that those roles are described, so more the application of role models, we see that most of the projects actually have defined a role model, which is logic because it are all demo projects and they need to describe use cases. And we see that the most adopted role model is indeed the harmonized role model. So that's good. There is a lot of, I would say, a lot of synergy in this case. However, what is interesting is that several projects have developed additional roles, in particular to describe some of the innovations related to product, services, and market design. So that will be important information to take on board for further updates of this harmonized role model. Next slide. If we then look at the barriers for those concepts that are developed in the projects, then we see that, so this slide is related to the barriers related to scalability and replicability of the different demos. And there, the one which is most important is the evolution of regulation. Even more important than sometimes technical challenges that might also have a huge burden on the potential of scalability. Next slide. If we then look at, if we have now a further zoom on those regulatory barriers, not just for the demos, but really for the concepts that we have developed, we have clustered them in 3 groups: technical, economic, and regulatory. Regulatory barriers are clearly the most important. However, technical barriers are also still existing. And there we saw that there's mainly a challenge related to the timing of the needs for the system and the possibility of flexibility to deliver the service when it's needed. And typically when you go to services that are more real time, we see that a lot of issues occur when flexibility sources have to react. And that's clearly a challenge that we have to take on board. If we look at the economic barriers, there is clearly also a link with regulation, but the elements that were most important to, let's say, hinder the economic viability of different solutions were first everything related to incentive mechanisms. So incentive rules for different technologies, for example, renewables versus storage. The tariff structures, what do you do with dynamic grid tariffs, and how, for example, will you include the existence of electric vehicles? Also related to that, the remuneration mechanisms of DSOs, so the typical, the CAPEX, OPEX discussions. These are actually elements where we say there additional steps need to be taken in order to remove some of the most important barriers. If we then look at regulation more in general, there are a lot of elements listed here, but mainly they come down to three big categories. First thing is, we see that regulation is too complex. It's fuzzy, it's not clear. The second element is that regulation is too slow. It's not following the speed of the market developments and the system developments that we see occur today. And the third element is that sometimes regulation might be clear, but then if we compare it across countries, it's not harmonized or standardized. Next slide. So if we then go to some of the conclusions and recommendations that were formulated by this working group, just to know for you, they still need to be approved by the European Commission, but I can give you already a flavor of what's in there. So first, when we indeed we ended with the lack of standardization. So we have here formulated a recommendation related to the standardization of products. Although we see that additional standardization of products might indeed decrease complexity for flexibility buyers, and it might also increase price transparency, we should somehow find an interesting trade-off between this additional standardization and a flexible approach that can respond better to the typical specific requirements of a certain system. So the recommendation here is that, yes, we can go for a bit more standardization, for example, ranges of products, but we might also need to consider if it's interesting to move away from the notion of products and go towards a system where we just define flexibility as a set of technical parameters so that system operators in a very dynamic way can use the flexibility for the different needs of the system. Next. Also, if we then look at the product development, we see that there is mainly a need for the development of products related to congestion management. And as it's both important by TSOs and DSOs, there are some elements we think you should take into account. First of all, the link with products developed for balancing services. This is also in line with what is proposed in the ASM report. The second thing, which is not very well covered, is the role of both active and reactive power when you develop services for congestion management. And the third one, which is important, is the implication for the coordination between system operators. In particular, if you go to joint procurement, where you start combining balancing congestion for TSO and DSO with active and reactive power. Next. So it's clear that coordination becomes important, but not only for congestion management. As mentioned before, we see that almost every project tackles coordination at different levels, but we see that it's mostly focused on coordination, which is closer to real time. So the recommendation here is that we also take into account the coordination necessary more long term, and that we should focus also research on network planning. Next slide. So if we then go to the different mechanisms, so indeed, most projects investigate those market-based flexibility mechanisms. However, it was also clear that those other mechanisms are still important, that they are also investigated, but maybe not with the same intensity as the market-based mechanisms. So there the recommendation is, it's very nice that we still have those different types of mechanisms. However, they are closely interlinked. So what we should do is to focus more on how those mechanisms relate to each other and make sure that there are no conflicts. For example, if you have dynamic connection agreements, dynamic grid tariffs, and on top of that, flexibility markets, it's clear that those three sources of flexibility, well, they can work very well together, but they could also make a complete mess of our flexibility system. So that's something we should address in future research. Next. If we then look at the role of the DSO, it's clear that the evolution of the role of the DSO is one of the, I would say, major challenges, but also major opportunities. However, it was mentioned by several projects that in order for the DSO to make this transition easier, we should work really on the incentivization of DSOs to use the flexibility. For example, via the remuneration mechanisms, but also a second element, regulatory sandboxing. And then a third element, which, although I would say it's rather high level, it was considered as very important. The promotion of some of the good examples within these projects, because there are so many projects out there, but often the good results are not highlighted enough. Next. Then talking about market design, as mentioned before, we saw that a lot of projects were focusing on distributed or more decentralized market concepts. And that's very interesting, but we see that the emergence of those new market design concepts also brings some challenges. So we should first of all look at what is then the impact on the coordination between system operators. It's clear that coordination in a distributed system is completely different compared to coordination in a more centralized system. And also what is important, as there are so many platforms that are emerging, indeed providing similar solutions, but according to different concepts, we should ensure the interoperability between those different platforms and different design concepts. And then a final recommendation, so next. So if we then look at indeed the role of the market operator for those different market platforms, the question whether it should be regulated or commercial is probably not so black and white. What we propose here is that we should look typically what are the activities a market operator should take on board, and then see what are the arguments for each of the sub-activities of market operation to stay or to become regulated, or to stay or become part of the commercial domain. And that's something which is also for future research important if we move ahead from those platforms which are now most of the time in a pilot mode towards real implementation at large scale. So these were all the elements I would like to say. Thank you for listening, and in case of questions, don't hesitate to put them on the chat or send them afterwards.
Thank you very much, Helena, for taking us through this very interesting presentation. There are many questions on the chat. Some of them are related to the when we can make available the slides, and for instance, if we publish our flexibility framework, so the slides will be made available. I think, and Helena, please correct me, with the exception of Helena's slides, which still need to pass actually the revision of the European Commission, because it's under the bridge initiative. And I will ask Helena also to answer, because we have foreseen actually the presentation of Kalle Cook from Ellering, which is leading the working group data management. If at that moment when you give us the green light, we can also take the slides of Kalle, because we didn't touch so much actually the data management, data exchange requirements, types of standards towards which we want to go. If you can say something about this.
Yeah, so indeed, the document that I just presented, it will be submitted to the European Commission by the end of this week, so tomorrow. And we hope to have a final go by the end of this year, so that at least before the Christmas break, it can be published and slides can be also made available.
Okay, thank you very much. The rest of the slides will be made available immediately after this webinar. So I would like to go now to the questions and answer session. And I will start maybe with Hakon. actually, we have seen that through this screening done inside ENTSO-E, but also in the Bridge initiative, we have many projects, mostly in the market related area. We have a lot of projects looking at storage mainly, but we also have demand response. Hakon, you showed in your slide actually this huge gap. Do you think that what we do now it's sufficient, or we still need more? And if you can say in which direction? Sorry, I think we had an issue with another webinar actually, which took us. I don't know how many people are still around. 20. So I will apologize this for this. I go forward. Hakon is not there anymore, I think. Helena, for the people who are left, and again apologizes, I would like to ask you actually when moving, we have seen that there are a lot of platforms, a lot of services, and you were mentioning that harmonization, standardization can be one option, but this needs to be taken into account by actually not losing maybe the local specificities, the national specificities. So where you would put the balance?
Yeah, so thank you, Norella, for the question. It's indeed, it's not so easy. Yeah? So what we were already promoting is that it's clear that maybe first, before emphasizing the harmonization and the standardization, I think that not all of those platforms will be able to exist. It's too much. There are too many different options. So what we think that additional research should do is to, first of all, look at what is the most optimal setup of a local market and a national market, so that we can maybe already go from 30 different options towards 10 different options. But then still we will have some more local platforms compared to some more central platforms. And then it's important to work on the interfaces and also on a certain standardization of products so that they can easily be transferred from one platform to another one. And that goes hand in hand with some, I would say, harmonization related to data and data models.
Thank you very much. And if I continue still with you, and then I will pass to Matthias. So how we managed to get a pan-European solution? So to also take into account maybe the cross-border view. So and then link to what we have, for instance, in ENTSO-E, the balancing platforms, which are more or less at pan-European level. So how do you see this type of development in order to upscale?
Yeah, so that's indeed one of the most tricky and challenging questions, because typically when you look at the coordination within a country, it's then TSO, DSO coordination. In particular for the DSO, if you start including the local grid constraints, it's a massive amount of data. If you then, in an efficient way, imagine that we would like combine on a central platform all information of low, medium, and high voltage from different countries for one, I would say, huge optimization, it will probably, at the level of computational effort, not possible to do that. For balancing, it's possible because it's, I would say, it's at the level of TSOs, and the number of calculation points is less. But as soon as you go deeper or lower in the grid, the number of calculation points becomes too difficult to solve it. So there, what we should work on, and it's not yet solved today, is some smart algorithms that can start to represent the physical reality of distribution grids, so that we then can include that in those platforms that are now already dealing with balancing, for example, because it will not be possible to put all the data in one platform. So that's one thing. We should look on smarter algorithms, statistics that can help us there. So that's clearly a research area that will become very relevant in the future. And the second one could be more working on rules, priority rules. It could be that we say that at a local level, we organize local platforms that as a priority solve congestion in a certain area. And then only a subset of the available flexibility or the available data will then be integrated with, I would say, more cross-border interconnected markets. That's another track where some researchers are thinking about. But of course, it's always a big discussion. Who should have priority to use a certain flexibility? So also there, that will need to have additional debate and research to see what is the most appropriate setup. Because the simple idea, let's put everything together in one giant optimization. Today, even with supercomputers, we're not able yet to calculate that in a time frame which is in line with the needs of the system that will become more real time in the future.
Helena, can you hear me?
Thank you very much, Helena. So Hakan, sorry, we were just thrown out by, I don't know, by another webinar or by, I don't know, by what. So if I go back to you and if you remember the question I asked you, please continue.
But did you hear anything of my answer, or shall I start from the beginning?
No, we didn't hear anything from your answer.
Okay, it was a very good one. No, I'm well, it's I think my first slide, the reason why I showed it was really to understand the scale of the challenge we have, which is so large, but still possible to solve if we manage to speed up the innovation and focus. And I think what we do today is one brilliant example of what we need to do more of, to understand the challenges seen from all the different players as aligned as we can, and try to find out areas which is really needed to increase the innovation and increase the new solutions we need. And one area explained today for me was really this, well, maybe it's a finding that you need more work into this congestion management actually in the physical grid on the lower level, to understand how we can cope with all these renewables coming into the grid in an even better way. And another example is that when we see the flex products shown by Matthias, we have some question mark of the missing areas as part of your question, Norella. And we need to understand more why it's not more activity into those areas. And I think what is really important now is that we try to highlight areas we should start now in order to deliver in 5 years, in 20 years, but year by year anyway, in the innovation roadmap. And the next RDIC plan will be more concrete, and we would like to have more showcases and use cases in order to understand how really to deliver this massive transformation we are just in the middle of. That was something I tried to answer, and I did it for myself, and now I did it twice. So I hope you heard it now.
Thank you very much. Now we have heard. I will like to conclude actually then with Matthias, although I didn't foresee this order. So Matthias, from your side, you have mentioned all these projects we have regarding frequency. We also have projects regarding congestion management. For you, I think one gap was the regulatory issue, and this is in a way was brought also by Helena in her slides. So from your point of view, the conclusion would be that where we should focus the research and innovation. And I think what we tackle a little bit less, it is more the long-term flexibility. So how we arrive there.
Yes, as you said, we have not found so many research projects on regulation, but of course, there's ongoing a lot of discussions in other forums than research projects on this. But still, it could be interesting, yeah, to see from a more neutral research perspective on this. And then also, what was the other question regarding long-term flexibilities? We saw that there's a lot of research ongoing on all this power to gas, and I think the people are aware of the need for this long-term flexibilities that can deliver over longer seasons. But also, if we speak about gaps here, or the gaps we try to find, it's really on the topic level to find, because it's not possible based on this mapping to say that a specific research topic or the state of the art on a typical research topic has not come far enough. It's more to see, is there enough research activities on the most important topics? And as we saw, at some point something maybe is missing, and is it a good reason for it? And if not, what could we do in ENTSO-E RDIC to push further, to get more activities in that area? That's the idea.
Thank you very much, Matthias. I think we come to the end of this webinar. So again, thank you to Helena who joined us, and thank you for Hakon for coming back after being out for a while. I think it was an interesting webinar where we also got some points regarding future research and innovation activities, and I hope for the participants that we provided a quite extensive overview of what is happening in the TSO regarding flexibility projects in research and development and innovation area, but also in the DSO and the other actors which can offer flexibility to the power system. Maybe what we reached less, it's actually customer perspective. So which is the value for the customer, which are the customer needs, because we focused mainly on the grid needs. But we have projects in the future, and I think for those who are aware of what is coming up in the Horizon 2020, so the future call TSO DSO customer will probably help us to touch also these aspects which we have seen less today. So thank you very much for attending. The slides will be made available except of those one of Helena, which will be posted later, as she mentioned. Thank you for listening to us, and you will be invited to other Business Network for Innovation webinars with other subjects. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing. Bye-bye.
Bye. Hello. I had a brilliant answer. Nobody listened.